The theme is found throughout Scripture. The widows and the orphans were oppressed the most in ancient society, but you know, the call did not go out to feel sympathy or compassion or even to pity them. The theological linchpin was, provide justice, will you? Not compassion. Just make the world more just. Right conditions have to be established for justice to exist. In Jeremiah, where he excoriates the king, and of course, I mean, that's in the job description. That's what prophets do, is just blast the king. In this case, Jeremiah just skewers the king for building an unneeded palace out of the most expensive materials that you can get, and painted it in the garish colors, and he used slaves to coerce work for those who, you know, would have to give it for free. And Jeremiah makes it crystal clear in communicating to the king that to know God, I mean, this is old biblical terms, to know God is to do justice. And he tries to explain to him, you know, as a king who pretends to love God, Jeremiah reminds him that he will never know God unless he exercises justice and righteousness. That is, as king, he's got to establish the right conditions in society for justice to unfold. So using, you know, the biblical language and the language of theology, God and justice are inseparable. Nowhere does a prophet implore compassion. The famous passage in Micah makes it obvious. What does God require of you but to do justly, to love tenderly, and walk humbly with God? To love tenderly is, I think, about as close as we'll ever get to compassion. But the work that remains in creating a fair world is exercising justice. Make the system in which we operate more fair. And as we all know, any child knows and understands fairness. Even in preschool, when squabbles are tried to be settled by parents or teachers, you're always going to hear a rejoinder from a little one who says, "That's not fair." There's something built into us that protests whenever we are wronged. It's not fair. You know, there's an inherent sensibility that retains some sense of right or wrong, or even good and evil. But issues of unfairness are not resolved in suffering along with others or feeling their wrongs. No, it's a matter of changing the system so that these wrongs will not be inflicted again. We need to build a more just society. Or again, in biblical language, we need to get to the point where we know God. Now, compassion works very well for individuals and in some cases even for small groups. The parable of the Good Samaritan shows an individual effort at compassion. The act is most commendable, but already we see its practicality questioned when the lawyer asks Jesus, and I paraphrase, "Do I have to treat everybody as my neighbor? I got my limits. What do you want from me? I can't do that." And our church community here in Salt Lake functions as a caring institution mainly by exercising compassion. Compassion for the stranger, compassion for the poor, for the sick, for each other. But in the reality of a brutal world, building a society based on compassion would only be swallowed up by those without compassion. More than half a century ago, the minister and theologian Reinhold Niebuhr wrote a powerful book called Moral Man and Immoral Society. He argued that while individuals could live by such criteria as compassion and love and selflessness, these achievements could not exist beyond a small human collective. Niebuhr, in fact, later commented that he should have titled the book Immoral Man and a Terribly Immoral Society. His point was that it was perfectly fine for people to live compassionately with one another, but they should not expect that compassion will work in the public arena. And this is long before the Tea Party. You know, he's saying compassion will not work in the public arena. Now, I fear that the Affordable Care Act focused on compassion in the public arena, at least initially. Obama wanted us to feel for and sympathize with those, understandably, he thought, feel for those who have pre-existing conditions and can't get health care. We need to have enough compassion for the poor who can't qualify for health care. But it's in that public arena. I mean, ask Ronald Reagan. Compassion does not work in the public arena. We can exhort a society to be just because we all have these deep feelings of what fairness actually means to some extent. But honestly, one cannot exhort a society to be compassionate. Theologically, the emphasis is less on changing individual behavior and hearts. It's more along the lines of transforming entire systems of structural injustice within which individuals are forced to operate. For example, the board of a large corporation will not ask, how can we increase profits in such a way that children will starve? That question is never formed. But they will ask, how can we increase profits since we have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders? So the outcome is they decide to transform vast agricultural acreage that sustains thousands of indigenous people, change that into a coffee plantation because they need a cash crop. And the effect is that the children of the region do starve, since the nutritious food is no longer being grown in the area. Now, theologically, the issue revolves around creating right conditions, where the people way up there at the top of the hill must, as God demands, must make life more fair, where privilege is no longer denied to the poor, widows, orphans, strangers. Although compassion is definitely seen as a vehicle for creating a more equitable society, we just can't wait for this to happen. We can't wait for all these hearts to change. Working for justice and demanding fairness remains really the only pathway we have to seeing God. Now, in our country, justice is constitutionally centered. For those who have this problem thinking that white-skinned lives are more important than dark-skinned lives, justice, not compassion, is what ultimately changes the conditions of a society. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, you can't make them love us, but you can stop them from lynching us. Marriage equality operates successfully under the same rubric. Only by confronting people and systems is there any change at all. Well, the prophets knew that all along. And now we have an interesting test case of marriage equality right here in Utah, which calls upon the Constitution to overpower the prejudices infecting people who desire to preclude fairness in how couples love each other. Gay and lesbian couples in Utah are not sitting around hoping that LDS authorities may one day come around to feeling compassion. Now, these couples are looking for justice, not compassion. Juan Luis Segundo, a great liberation theologian, once remarked that the world should not be the way it is. What a simple observation. The world should not be the way it is. And so in a world where millions of Americans suffer, and so many of them are children, suffer because they're denied health care, President Obama wants to change the world to something it should be. It should be more fair. And we all know what fairness looks like, and I think we've understood that since childhood. But I believe the mistake made by Obama was playing the card of compassion rather than framing health care as a matter of justice. I believe he tried to move people emotionally with his very eloquent rhetoric, move them to have enough sympathy to reach out to those at the very bottom of the hill. But compassion never succeeds in the public arena. I didn't remember this Friday's Tribune. It was the morning after the death of Nelson Mandela, the political cartoon depicting Mandela sitting at the desk with the lessons that he taught the world. And at the top of the list was justice, followed by reconciliation, forgiveness, and peace. Those were his lessons. Compassion was not part of the platform. The LDS bishop in Taylorsville, who disguised himself as a homeless man, remember this at Thanksgiving? Disguised himself in his ward. He was surprised at how little compassion there was right there in his ward. Compassion does not succeed in the public arena. I personally like Aristotle's definition of justice. And I have a hard time conceiving that people like our governor, or John Boehner, or Tea Party enthusiasts, or members of the Taylorsville ward wouldn't understand this very simple call to fairness. Aristotle said, justice is making sure that each child gets his or her due. A society that gives priority to the needs of children will come close to being a just society. Yeah. And the Affordable Care Act seeks to do precisely that. Give each child his or her due and build strong families. Now, if you have compassion, you know this already. If you have no compassion, well, it doesn't really matter that much, because theologically, all you need to do is prepare the way for justice, to change conditions that create structural injustice. It's a matter of knowing what is fair, and the seeds of that knowledge dwell already within us. And so the work that lies ahead is to create the conditions in our society so that justice may flow like mighty streams.